Hey, it's Josh Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And every photo and video that you're seeing in this feature focus is taken on the cameras of the Huawei P9. Now, after we've done our full review of the Huawei P9 and we did some extra coverage of it as well, I wanted to take the cameras out, these Leica-powered cameras, and take a look at their quality in a number of different situations. But first, we'll take a few selfies with the front-facing 8-megapixel camera, on which you can still use the beauty mode, which, in my opinion, is still kind of odd to use at times. It does help with the skin tones and softening the image, but it can be a little bit severe at times. But for general purposes, selfies are great on the P9. What the hell is it? Now we're going to go through exactly how the Huawei P9's cameras work, the dual camera setup, but before then we'll take a look at some of the extra features. What you're looking at are a couple of panoramas which already show the kind of quality you can get from the P9 in very good lighting conditions, but also they're stitched together quite well. But a feature that does return in the P9, which was popular in other Huawei phones, is the defocusing feature. Now, this isn't necessarily something that's new, but it is interesting to use on this phone. You can pick a portion of the viewfinder and then pick an f-stop to emulate, as open as 0.95 actually. What that means is that you get that particular bit of focus on that point, and then everything else has this nice creamy effect around it. It's nice to have when you want to have some pretty artistic photos, but since it is emulating the effect, what it does is it tries to find the subject and then makes that clear compared to everything else. Now, compared to an actual lens that has a real aperture ring to it, this is actually a very artificial effect, and it's kind of plain to see in a lot of these photos. So while these photos could look quite nice, it is still a software effect, so you have to keep that in mind. HDR is decent on the P9 even though you have to trigger it yourself in the menu, but it does bring up the shadows and adds a little bit of color saturation to the entire scene. But as you look at this HDR photo, I can go ahead and start talking about the Huawei P9's dual camera setup. Essentially, you have two 12-megapixel cameras at f2.2 aperture, and one of them is a monochrome sensor. Essentially, all it is doing is gauging in a black and white photo, as you can see here, because you can still take black and white photos in a monochrome mode. It's just taking into account how much light is hitting the sensor based upon the different subjects and different objects inside of the scene. And by using that information, it will then put the color onto the photo from the other sensor, the original RGB sensor, and be able to give even better contrast and ultimately a little bit better detail inside of these photos. The results are actually quite good. The f2.2 aperture may not necessarily be ideal for low light shots, but we'll get into that in a little bit. And saturation actually looks pretty good. It's not too dull or too severe, but what really gets us here is that there's a lot of contrast in these. Now that's exactly what Huawei was trying to do here, and you'll see in a lot of these photos, especially in broad daylight, that there are some pretty dark areas of a photo and some very bright areas of a photo, and you can see that they kind of marry the two very well in these scenes. The dynamic range is actually really good here, and the two cameras working in conjunction seems to do the job quite well. Videos unfortunately don't get the same treatment. While the colors still look pretty nice, there's no optical image stabilization, so you still need a steady hand, and then you also don't get any 4K video recording, so 1080p is pretty much all you're going to be working with. And in lower light situations, the f2.2 aperture shows its disadvantage, as videos can be quite grainy and necessarily aren't the best compared to plenty of other competitors. Speaking of low lights, we can go ahead and gradually go into low light situations with the Huawei P9, and you'll see that even in indoor situations, the saturation does start to taper off just a little bit. But that's not too big of a deal considering the scene we're working with. Now, I do have a lot of foodie pictures here, and you can still see that the contrast is being captured quite well, with the highlights still being well separated from the shadows, which is obviously what Huawei was trying to do here. It makes for a pretty dynamic photo, especially when you have a high range, and from there, there, you can just get some pretty nice looking photos even in indoor situations. It's in lower light shots, as you can see here inside of a brewery, that while the contrast is still a high priority, you start to see the noise. And with a f2.2 aperture, of course, these photos are not going to necessarily be the most ideal situation for the Huawei P9's cameras. The other thing that I had to make sure I had was a steady hand, because with these slower shutter speeds that were needed in order to properly expose the photo, having any little bit of shake could have made these photos all a little bit blurry. But I'll get into, finally, the main low-light situation that I've already alluded to in a number of concert videos, and that is Us the Duo opening for Pentatonix. And it's in these situations that you get a massive amount of contrast, and it could be hard for a camera to actually provide a good-looking photo because it has to deal with two very high-contrast areas, the stage and, of course, the darkened audience. Now, the other supposed benefit of having a monochrome sensor is that its data of where it only sees how much light is hitting the sensor and where in the scene that light is coming from, is that it could provide a little bit more detail in these photos. And I actually think that that is the case, and this is the prime example that I have of that. Zooming into some of these photos, as you've probably seen already with the 100 crop, shows that Pentatonix, even though they're far away, are actually quite nicely detailed. Of course, these aren't going to be perfect photos by any means, and there's plenty of noise in the darkened areas, but as far as concert photos go, once I played around with the exposure compensation just a little bit to make sure Pentatonix was not blown out, they actually provided some pretty great photos of this concert that I was able to attend. Overall, I think that this little experiment that Huawei and Leica are doing is kind of a proof of concept. Taking the information that a monochrome sensor can provide actually made these photos look quite contrasty in a good way, and actually bumped up the details in some particular photos. Not all of them, but in some of them. You still have to be a little bit careful because there are some glaring holes in the overall experience. A lack of 4K video recording, which really showed as you saw in this video, and the lack of optical image stabilization, which also proved to be a bit of a problem as well. But if you're looking for some pretty nice photos in well-lit situations, the Huawei P9 is actually a pretty good performer, and I do hope that we see this setup in a future device, maybe with better aperture numbers and also a little bit more thought put into the software. And so there you have it for this feature focus on the Huawei P9 cameras. It is not necessarily the kind of camera that is able to handle literally any situation, but in the places that it does succeed, it does so with flying colors and contrast. Keep it tuned to Android Authority for all of the coverage on the Huawei P9, and don't forget to head on over to our sister sites as well, so you can see even more beyond the world of Android. And then remember to stay around, because we are your source for all things Android.